Right, good to be with you tonight. It is the news feed late night. I am Thabo Mdluli. The trial of former Minneapolis Police Officer Derek Chauvin, who is charged with the killing of George Floyd, has entered its 8th day. Of the past few days, current and former police officers have been testifying, with Minneapolis Police Chief Medaria Arradondo stating that Chauvin did not act within the police's department's policies and ethics when it comes to him placing his knee on George Floyd's neck. Joining me to talk about the trial, police arresting procedures, and much more that is coming out of the trial is former LAPD officer and author Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey, as well as a member of the Democrats abroad, South Africa, Ricardo Gressel, will join us a bit later on. But we also have Geopolitical Security advisor and author Bradley Steyn. You can also be a part of this conversation tonight. Tag us on Twitter at Newsroom405 or WhatsApp your questions and your comments to 072-110-5584. Good evening to you both, or good day on your side, and thank you very much for your time tonight here on the Newsfeed Late Night.
Thank you for having me.
Sergeant
Good evening, thanks.
Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey, I'll begin with you. Currently hearing testimony from a senior special agent, a lead investigator in this matter, but also an expert in the use of force policy, James Reyerson. What have we heard so far?
Well, we've heard that the force that was used on Mr. Floyd was unreasonable, it was not necessary, and it violated the Minneapolis Police Department's policy on use of force.
And this is consistent, I suppose, with the testimony that we've been hearing, at least from 9 police officers who have been testifying so far, including the current top cop in Minneapolis, the chief of police, who gave testimony to the effect pretty much to say this was not a trained tactic. There was a violation of policies around de-escalation, objectively reasonable use of force, and requirements to render aid. I mean, these are serious violations, Sergeant Dorsey.
Absolutely, and you know, you have to take into account that when Derek Chauvin arrived on scene, the officers had already reported what we call Code 4. In other words, everything is fine, we've got it. And that had already been declared when he arrived. Mr. Chauvin was already in handcuffs, already in the back of a police car, and Derek Chauvin arrived on scene putting on his black gloves because he wanted to show these rookie officers how to tame a black man, pulled Mr. Floyd out of the vehicle, laid him on the ground, tortured him, and ultimately murdered him after 9 minutes and 29 seconds.
He was in prone position, not resisting, handcuffed, not attempting to evade or even resist. In your view, in your opinion, should force have been used at that point?
Once the handcuffs go on a suspect, it's over. And officers are trained and taught only to use that force necessary.
Okay, great.
All right, we seem to have a technical issue there. Sergeant Dorsey, you can go on.
Officers are taught to use only the force necessary to overcome whatever resistance a person is exerting. And once the handcuffs go on, then you have to de-escalate. And it doesn't matter what's going on the sidelines. There's a lot of talk about the crowd that was gathering was somehow intimidating, because that's what they say every time there's more than 2 or 3 black folks together. They were scary. And this is a tenured 19-year veteran police officer who's accustomed to dealing with uncooperative, combative suspects, if that's what Mr. Floyd was. But we saw on the video that he was none of that. He was not being quiet, obviously, but that is inherent to police work. And you don't get to sit on his neck and punish him because he won't sit still as you're directing.
Let's hear a little bit from that testimony of the chief of police there, Chief Arradondo. Listen to what he said.
Once Mr. Floyd, and this is based on my viewing of the videos, once Mr. Floyd had stopped resisting, and certainly once he was in distress and trying to verbalize that, That should have stopped. There's an initial reasonableness in trying to just get him under control in the first few seconds, but once there was no longer any resistance, and clearly when Mr. Floyd was no longer responsive and even motionless, to continue to apply that level of force to a person proned out, handcuffed behind their back, that in no way, shape, or form is anything that is by policy, it is not part of our training, and it is certainly not part of our ethics or our values.
That is Police Chief there, Arradondo, giving a testimony at the Derek Chauvin murder trial. Joining us in the conversation is Ricardo Gressel, as well as Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey and Bradley Steyn. Ricardo, good evening, and thank you very much for your time tonight on the Newsfeed Late Night. A question is asked, Ricardo, the incoming administration of President Joe Biden, how serious are they in bringing change? Do they care enough about the for example, unnecessary use of force? In fact, one of the officers testifying said deadly use of force.
Well, I think there's no doubt. I think that the campaign that brought Kamala Harris, the Madam Vice President, and President Joe Biden was based a lot on their ability to use the law. With Kamala Harris's experience as a district attorney and a senator of California, she knows the law, and she's very familiar with prosecuting and with making sure that the law sticks. But as we heard from Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey, is that there's a fairness that has to play in with being strong and stringent with the law. So first is knowing the law, and then second of all is to make sure that you apply the law fairly. So when the law is applied fairly, it is not based on color, it's not based on gender, it's not based on any sorts of discrimination or prejudice that we've experienced in the United States for too long now. And I think as the discussion goes further, we're learning more and more about the will of the people to determine how not only our laws are created through the legislature, but also how they're enforced through our police departments and the judicial system.
What do you think went wrong here in as far as what you're saying? Because there is clearly policies that are in place. Police chiefs saying, well, this is not part of what officers are trained to do as far as the tactic is concerned. There is a violation, one of the policies around the tactic that was used and whether or not it was a reasonable use of force. What do you think went wrong there?
Well, I think it goes back to training. There's no doubt about it. In training, there's the theoretical training and there's the practical training. So the theoretical training says is that we're going to make sure that it's fair and equitable, that we make sure that if people cross a line, that we give fair punishment, not unusual punishment. But I think what happens in the practical is that there's emotions involved. There is experience involved, and certainly there's bias and prejudice that's involved. So no matter how well we do with our physical training, there has to be psychological and emotional training. I think all too often people, when they consider abuse, they think about it in terms of physical sense, whether it's gender-based violence, whether it's racism, whether it's sexism. We spend a lot of time on what happens from a physical perspective, but to be proactive and to be preventative, especially in the use of law, is to consider the psychological and emotional effects that you have, especially as a person in a position of power, and especially when we're considering the police. So the training has to include psychological and emotional training, not just the physical training.
Bradley Steyn, was there a lack of training in how police responded in your situation?
Yes, absolutely. But I can't per se talk about my situation because I am in the middle of civil litigation. But I will speak to what my two colleagues have said here tonight, and that is that ultimately the burden of de-escalation does not fall on private citizens. It falls on the police officers. And like Ricardo just stated, the key is to make sure that the police officers, when they're being screened to come into service, that they can handle the stress of these situations, and that they pass mental health checks, etc. This is an incredibly stressful position to be put in, and you need to make sure that everybody is that's responding to these situations are effectively well trained and well screened. So it boils back to institutionalized racism within these police departments that go back many, many years, and it boils down to the police unions that protect them and these police officers with their crass historical behavior. Obviously, not all of them are bad, but the bigger problem is getting rid of the bad apples and letting the good law enforcement officers continue in service to their communities.
Right. In the last 8 days, we have watched some gruesome footage coming out, in fact, taking us back to what happened in 2020. I mean, how important is the fact that now, in fact, one of the witnesses saying, we are lucky we have this now videotaped. We could be foggy in terms of remembering exact details, but that now we are able to capture this on video. How important is that, Bradley, in the prosecution of these cases?
Well, it's very important, but then again, we have a look at and see the prime example of what happened in Los Angeles in the 80s when Rodney King was beaten to a pulp and so violently beaten. There was video of this as well. And, the whole of Los Angeles, was basically set on fire. Everybody was up in arms and everybody was mad about it. The problem is that nothing has changed since then. So we need to have a look at the institutionalized historic approach to policing, and we need to deconstruct that with regards to, making sure that, we have the right fit people within those law enforcement positions. Is it going to help with the prosecution and the jury's ultimate decision? Yes, I think so, because it's going to show in black and white and on voice recordings that, Mr. George Floyd had the life squeezed out of him, and we heard him say, "I can't breathe." So, but the issue remains, again, the police unions that are protecting these bad apple cops.
Yeah. We'll talk to that issue of the blue wall of silence when we continue next with Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey, Ricardo, Gressel, and Bradley Steyn. You can be a part of it as well. The conversation on Twitter is @Newsroom405. WhatsApp your questions and comments to 072-110-5584. The Newsfeed Late Night continues next. Back with the Newsfeed Late Night in conversation with former Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey of the LAPD, Ricardo, Gressel, and Bradley Steyn. You can be a part of the conversation tonight as well by joining us on Twitter or on WhatsApp on 072-110-5584. Now, before the break, Bradley mentioning, of course, the issue of people coming forward and actually being honest and open about these abuses that are happening as and when they witnesses, particularly from within the police force. Now, Sergeant Dorsey, we have seen at least 8 to 9 police officers testifying against their own, including the chief of police. Give me your perspective on how significant this is. Is it a rare thing to see happen, or at least is it a rare thing to see it happen so publicly and televised?
It's a rare thing to see happen publicly and televised. It's not uncommon for police officers to testify against their peers, either in an administrative hearing, is where it happens most often, or if there's a criminal situation. But in this instance, we have a patrol sergeant first on scene who testified. We heard from a lieutenant, a commander, and ultimately the police chief as to whether or not Mr. Floyd was dealt with in a fair and equitable manner. And we know that not to be true. But listen, let me just say this. While I appreciate their candor and honesty, none of them get any brownie points, because all of them, according to the sergeant, he knew Derek Chauvin. The police chief grew up on that department with Derek Chauvin and successfully sued the Minneapolis Police Department himself for racism. And so how do you allow an officer with 18 personnel complaints, you know he exists, you know he's out there, to continue to prey on the community? But for Mr. Floyd having died, Derek Chauvin would have gone on to get his 19th personnel complaint and possibly continue to do great damage. And so the city had to settle, pay the family $27 million, and part of this public testimony and flogging of Derek Chauvin is just more damage control.
How much credibility do you think does it add to the case of the defense that this testimony is being given by the former and current police officers?
It's going to be very difficult for the defense to overcome what command staff is saying. I mean, you have administrators, trainers saying this is not our policy. This is not what we teach train our officers to do. And couple that with the professionals who were on duty and off duty. I'm talking about firefighters and EMS who stated that when they arrived, Mr. Floyd was deceased and had to almost pry Derek Chauvin off of his dead body to transport him to a hospital. And so all of that is going to be very difficult. These are credible, legitimate professional people, not civilians who normally are told, well, you don't know what it is to be the police. So it's going to be very difficult to overcome. And we see already them starting to dirty up Mr. Floyd by talking about his past indiscretions and putting him on trial, which is blatantly unfair.
Yeah, right. Let's talk a little bit about that, what the defense has been trying to bring about. I mean, right at the onset of the trial, we heard testimony from Courtney Ross, who is possibly the closest witness to date to Mr. Floyd, who has given personal testimony on their use of opioids. And how that became a challenge in their life. Do you think that is going to really play any role at all in the trial?
We'll have to wait and see. I mean, we're going to have to find out whose story is more compelling in the minds of the jury, and understand the decision has to be unanimous. All the defense really needs to do is convince one juror that, yes, Mr. Floyd, as he's being described, is 6 foot to 6'5", is scary, displayed inhumane strength, and had this drug problem, medical condition, and all of that somehow contributed to his death and had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that he was choked basically for 9 minutes and 29 seconds by Derek Chauvin. All they need to do is convince one to hang this up.
All right, Ricardo, talk to me then about how do you begin institutionally, as Bradley mentions, that there are institutional historic appearances of such brutalities and flouting of policies that exist within the various police departments in the U.S. How do you begin institutionally to dismantle these historic issues?
I think the first thing is to educate on, where the police emanated from. And I think, a lot of folks, when I did my homework and had to look back at, where this stems from, you have to go back to, fugitive slaves. And you have to go back to how white men were empowered to capture slaves and were paid for it. And anyone that went against that, whether they were civilians that wanted to ring up slaves, lynch them, whip them, shoot them, if they didn't want to participate in that, they were fined and they were ostracized from their white communities. So we got to know where this stems from. We got to understand what the intention of the early day informal police departments were and how that played a role in the first police departments in the North, which, unlike the South, were less about slavery. They were more about the immigrants. So between being a slave or being an immigrant, if you were non-white, any person of color, you were ostracized as a potential criminal. And the sergeant says it best, that he was 6 feet to, he is 6 feet to 6'5". He is dark in complexion. I mean, these are historic mores and ways of ostracizing a person, as opposed to talking about him as a father, or talking about him as someone who had a girlfriend who was helping him to get through his challenges in life. And this is where I think that going back to the psychological and the emotional is to not only understand the history, but to understand how people interact in society and how we are supposed to behave. If you are an unarmed person, unarmed, it does not require a whole lot, even if you are 6'5", to be able to control that person, especially if you're more than one police officer. What we continue to forget is that in every one of these cases of redlining, in every one of these cases of brutalization of black men and of women, the suspects are unarmed, irrespective of why they were pulled over, why their houses were battered in, why they may be accused of what they are accused of. They are unarmed. And I think that is the realization that says that how much more ammunition do you need as a police officer besides your gun, besides your billy club, besides your mace and any other equipment you have to take down a person? Why would you need to kill a person that is unarmed? It goes back to the beginnings of slavery, where you were allowed to actually use whips, chains, and guns on unarmed fugitive slaves.
Yeah. Sergeant Jenna Scurry, who was on dispatch watching this arrest unfold on CCTV camera, thought for a moment the video had frozen because police officers kept that position on the neck of Mr. Floyd for close to 9 minutes. When she called her supervisory sergeant, she says, "Call me a snitch if you want, but this is what I've just witnessed," and I think it's something that you need to look at. I mean, those words themselves, Ricardo, what do they tell us about what the police officers themselves think about doing what is right?
Well, it says, as you said with the previous question, is that we've got a long way to go. But again, I think, when I think about what, Sergeant Cheryl said about that this isn't just about the innocent bystanders and the witnesses to the crime, that it gets to the level of surveillance that is both from the officers as well as the public. We've gotten to a stage in society where we can't even believe each other. We can't even believe our own eyes or our own mouths. We can't even trust another person based on bias, based on prejudice, and based on a history of being discriminatory to the point of death. So for me, it just reeks of, have we gotten to the point where we need AI and we need robots to monitor us? Or as human beings and as humanitarians, can we not trust each other and be able to say, what you're doing is wrong, irrespective of your title? Can we not look at leadership as opposed to titles and as opposed to stature in society? And I think that's where we've gone wrong in the United States, that we've looked beyond leadership and we've looked at bosses and titles and stature and color that have dictated supremacist behavior and allowed it to happen. So, for me, I think what's critical going forward in terms of progress is to really look at how we can not only train our police officers, but I think really start looking at how do we behave in a crime scene? What are some of the tips that police officers can give the community and work with the community to not only prevent crime, but when crime happens, what is the best behavior that we can have, especially when there's no professional support around to help control the situation?
We come back in a moment with Ricardo, Gressel, Bradley Steyn, and Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey, as well as your views and thoughts tonight at Newsroom 405. WhatsApp your questions and comments to 072-110-5584. The Newsfeed Late Night continues next. Welcome back. You're with us here on the Newsfeed Late Night. Thanks for staying on. We have, of course, been covering much of what's coming out of that trial of Derek Chauvin, been carrying it for the last 2 days. And we thought today, let's just unpack a little bit of the testimony we've heard so far, at least in the last 9 days. Of course, the defense still expected to bring its own witnesses in this trial. Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey, Ricardo, Gressel, and Bradley Steyn with me tonight. You're a part of the conversation on Twitter at Newsroom405, or WhatsApp your questions and your comments to 072-110-5584. Sergeant Dorsey, talk to me about the fact that the passenger in Mr. Floyd's car, Morris Hall, plans to plead the Fifth. How this could impact the case for the prosecution?
Well, it shouldn't have anything to do with it. And there's a lot of deflection. There's a lot of confusion of events and hypotheticals, and none of that has anything to do with the bottom line, which is what we're all there to consider. Was the force used against Mr. Floyd reasonable given the circumstances? And so who testifies, who doesn't, none of that in my mind should have any bearing on whether or not Mr. Chauvin is found guilty, much like, he may not testify. And so we can't make much of that either. So this witness, this passenger in the vehicle, is a moot issue as far as I'm concerned.
Now, you've previously said there needs to be a relook, particularly in the training of police when it comes to crowd control. Now, there is this whole testimony that was given around whether or not the police officers perceived a crowd as a threat. Yesterday, Jody Steiger saying that he did not perceive the crowd as a threat. They could have been hurling insults at him and saying whatever, but he did not see them as a threat. Define for me what you would perceive as a hostile crowd.
Well, I would assume that if the crowd were advancing on the officers and they weren't obeying commands to stand down, not invade their personal space, certainly then you get on the radio and you ask for additional units to come and meet that force. In other words, we never want to have more civilians than we have officers if we can avoid that. But this wasn't a menacing crowd. I mean, there were children in that crowd. And so this is an attempt by the defense through questions to say that somehow Derek Chauvin's perception was, I've got this hostile crowd and I can't attend to Mr. Floyd's medical need because I've got to keep my mind and my eye on the crowd. And we know none of that is true. We saw him sit there and watch him murder Mr. Floyd. And so the perception of the officer that they're trying to portray is also unreasonable.
Yeah. Positional asphyxia, is that a term that is top of mind when it comes to law enforcement in the United States?
When it comes to, we hear that all the time because we see officers deploy techniques that restrict someone's airway, and you can prevent blood and air from circulating to the brain in a number of ways. You choke someone with your hands, you can use your arms as we're taught and trained. And in this instance, while this was an improvised technique, because we're never taught to put our knee on the neck of anyone or the base of the neck, only between the shoulder blades. And so that term is something that we're very familiar with and is often bantered about.
Bradley, talk to me about your views on, for example, the defense lawyer Eric Nelson painting the crowd as angry, saying the crowd was growing angrier and angrier. In fact, one of the witnesses, Donald, actually a security guard, pushed back and said, no, I grew professional and professional. Bradley, I think you're muted there. If you can unmute for us.
My apologies. Like the sergeant said earlier on, it all boils down to deflection, and that's what that's what Chauvin's attorney is busy doing here. At one stage, Mr. Chauvin had his hands in his pockets, if I recall, and his knee on George Floyd's neck, squeezing the life out of him. So surely, if you're going to be concerned about a crowd moving in on you, you're not going to have your hands in your pockets. You're going to have your hands out so that you can deflect if anybody attacks or does anything like that. So, it's the whole thing is a bunch of nonsense, in my opinion. The fact that they're trying to paint Mr. Floyd as a drug user, etc., that's got nothing to do with any of this. What it boils down to is that, they didn't use protocols and procedures, and, this police officer just really wanted to put the hurt on here, and he took it too far, and he took an innocent man's life, and that's not acceptable.
Yeah. We're pretty much here expecting and asking, or maybe even demanding of officers to approach arrests, even protests, with an understanding of the humanity that they need to do it with, and they must be relatable to the people that they are dealing with. Is that a tall ask, Bradley?
I don't think so at all. For instance, the Black Lives Matter march that I attended last year, right after the murder of George Floyd, because a lot of countries, a lot of towns in the United States were completely appalled by, the handling of Mr. Floyd. And, different people from different backgrounds all came out and peacefully started protesting and having their hands up, and the police just escalated it. So, all it takes, like I said, is one bad actor within that police department that just escalates the situation, and then you'll find yourself in the middle of a riot, and that's what happened in Los Angeles. So you need to have proper, cool-headed leadership, from your sergeants up that are able to control these rookie police officers that perhaps don't have the experience that more seasoned officers have, and if the situation's too stressful for them, they need to rotate them out and put them on a different post where they aren't necessarily in contact with people that are allowed to, constitutionally allowed to, go and march for as part of their civil rights.
Yeah. All right. Ricardo, we're seeing actually something happening in Capitol Hill, and it's been reported, at least in the last couple of days, of more and more attacks, and even the security forces there being a little bit overwhelmed. I mean, if you look at all that in the picture of what we have been seeing and the kind of riots that have ensued following, for example, the murder of George Floyd, what does this tell us about the state of the U.S. and its security apparatus at this point?
Well, if you're talking about the reaction of the public, I just think it's reached a boiling point. I just think that it's just gone on for too long, and I think that the administrations, prior to the Biden administration, and for many administrations, especially coming from conservative right-wing parties, there's been a narrative that has been continuing to be part of the American fabric, unfortunately, which speaks to a we the people that doesn't include people of color. So, every time there's we the people, and we as people of color get excited to say, yes, we're for the Constitution, they say, no, we're not talking about that Constitution. And that it almost seems like it's a facade, that the forefathers that spoke about the fact that all men are created equal, the fact that, you have protection under the law, it was for noble Englishmen in the colonies, and that's what modern society, especially from our right-wing conservatives, have begun to brainwash Americans to believing that they're losing their freedom, that somehow because the multiculturalism has grown, and perhaps there has been a seemingly it's a facade, but maybe white folks think that they're no longer in power, that this fear is what they want to continue to address. So what happens is there's a boiling point. there comes a time where you say enough is enough. I mean, all the peaceful protests that I grew up with, my sister and my brother were both part of the 60s and the protest movements, the same things that we're talking about now in terms of policing, but also in terms of women's rights and discrimination against who you love. It's been going on for so long, and in my generation, I didn't think that my children would have to protest against the same things. I thought maybe there'd be some new things maybe to protest against, but it's still humanitarian issues around, we're all equal under the law. We're all equal under, on God's green earth. But there just is this question of difference that we don't celebrate, that race was created. It is a fallacy, but it was created to divide and to conquer. And I just don't think that until we get that right, we'll be able to stop protests, whether they be peaceful protests or whether they be violent protests. I think that protesting against systems and institutions that want to perpetuate white supremacy, they can't exist. So they're going to continue to have to be dismantled, unfortunately, peacefully or violently.
Yeah. I'm also worried because a police officer was killed here and another one injured. Does this event of this nature happening on Capitol Hill add to this tension and this nervousness of police around crowds and around people and even in situations of arrest?
Of course it does. I mean, I think, what it says is that, bullets don't have color. And the anger that someone might have against a particular person of color is that there are always casualties. And there's also heroes and heroines. And we're finding them in women. We're finding them in white people. We're finding them in black folks. And a lot of us who have a critical mind and can look at circumstances, we celebrate those heroes and heroines. But almost you don't want to over celebrate the fact that we shouldn't have to be living this way. So whether it's victims of violence or whether it's heroes or heroines that are trying to protect societies against violence, it's nonsensical, it's unnecessary, and it's built on ideologies that are false narratives that continue to talk about systems and processes that are meant to dismantle democracy and not celebrate democracy. And until we can look at what legislative powers are supposed to do, which is in terms of protecting us in terms of law, and the judicial system to support that, and until we get that balance right, that the intentions of what is written in law is as important as what is written, then I think we've got a challenge. Because if the intentions are not the same as what is actually written, then people will begin to question belief systems. They'll begin to question which people are you talking about. When people, I thought as a child and certainly growing up in my adolescent years, that people were people. And it's only later that you learn, as we've learned from Martin Luther King and we've learned from Nelson Mandela and many others, is that hate has to be learned. And so in that desire to want to stop the violence, it starts at home. It starts with mom and dad and grandmother and grandfather, uncle and cousin, to actually speak to the importance of humanity comes first, that we have to look after each other first. And when we look after each other and we're on the street and we're in society and we're outside of the comforts of our nest, we still behave with decency and with dignity. And that the only time that we need to bring in professional services is when it's an exception. But right now, it seems like it's the rule that more and more camera phones have to be pulled out, that body cams have to be used, and we have to use this excessive force, whether it's on the protester side or whether it's on bad policing side, in order to get the types of results that we desire.
Let's see some reaction tonight on social media to this conversation. We got a WhatsApp message coming through from Tigere Muringa in Cape Town saying, a question to Sergeant Dorsey: what practical models have you used in the U.S. to combat police brutality? Suggest one that we can use here in South Africa because the situation is worse and unprecedented. Sergeant Dorsey?
Well, I think community-based policing worked well on the Los Angeles Police Department. I think it's important for a police force to be able to relate to the community that they serve. I think it's important to have people who look like you, who value your quality of life concerns, to be a part of that force. And that's why I say here, if you have angst with the police department, get on it. Join the police department, because change will come from the outside, but certainly you can have influence if you are partnered up with an errant officer. Had there just been one officer on scene with Derek Chauvin who had the intestinal fortitude to pull him off and tell him stop, maybe Mr. Floyd would be here today. And so I think it's important to get to know the community, have relatability, and like the others have said, to treat a person as you would want them to treat your own family member. After all, before Mr. Floyd was a black man, before I am a black woman, I'm a human being. And we have rights just on the strength of that, to be free from torture, freedom to pursue our life as we see fit. And so if we just deal with one another as human beings first, I think we'll find ourselves in a much better place.
This one from Puledi Shoba in East London. Officer Chauvin may be convicted if found guilty and Mr. Floyd's family compensated, but this will not eradicate the obvious racism that exists within the Minneapolis Police Department. Floyd's death is just a drop in the ocean in respect to the horrendous police conduct treatment on blacks over the years. There's an urgent need for a total overhaul of the police department. Otherwise, another George Floyd is waiting to die at the hands of the police. Thank you very much, Puledi, for that message. And that's where we're going to have to leave it for tonight. Thanks to Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey, Ricardo Gressel, and Bradley Steyn for joining us tonight. The news feed late night continues for you in a moment with what's making news around the African continent.